Hello everyone, this is Seth Garrett and welcome back to Transcendent Philosophy. Today we are going to be going over one of my most important blog articles. I promise you this is going to be worth it. Hang with me, let's get through this one, let's get to the end. This one is going to build the foundation of a naturalistic morality, and it's going to show, it's not going to fully argue, but it's going to show how this type of a morality can be objective in a way. It's going to hint at that. My next blog article is going to go deeper into the objectivity, but this is huge because if we can dig down to the root of morality, if we can figure out where morality comes from, get way down to the bottom, what does that mean? It means we know where it comes from, we know what it is, we know how to measure it, we know how to connect with other people with regards to their morality, we know how to organize our societies based on morality, we know how to stop fighting, and we know how to unite on correct moral principles if we know what morality is in the first place. So this is huge. If we care about unity, if we care about peace, if we care about brotherhood, love, if we care about avoiding civil war, figuring out how to get to the common ground on morality is essential, because morality is one of the most important things that people care about. Morality is the definition of good and evil. And good and evil, those are things people will fight and die for. So we can't take this topic lightly. If people are going to kill each other over a civil war, it's because they believe that one side is evil and they believe that their side is good, and that they are fighting for good principles. They are fighting for good morality. They think that their goodness is under threat, and the only way that they can keep the precious goodness that they have is through violence. And we need to figure out how to transcend and overcome all of our issues when it comes to the sphere of morality. And so I'm hoping that this explication, this investigation of how morality works, where it comes from, what it means, and how to get to an understanding of it, I'm hoping that this can help build a foundation that people can work off of to connect and build a better morality. Without further ado, let's kind of dig into how this fits into the bigger framework of things. So, jumping over here to the list of my blog articles, I want to make sure you understand how this fits into this chain. The very beginning of my chain of articles on morality talks about David Hume's guillotine. Is ought moral logic? This one is really important to kind of understand how chains of moral logic are constructed, because as David Hume pointed out, you can't just have one is statement and one ought conclusion. Morality is more complex than that. We have to dig into deeper layers. So in order to have one moral conclusion, we have to have a moral premise. But a moral premise, that's a moral conclusion in and of itself. So behind a moral premise is another moral premise, and then there's another moral premise, and we can dig deeper and deeper and deeper. But what happens? Is it an infinite regress? Is there no end to the chain of moral premises? Or do we find rock bottom somewhere? Well, rock bottom, we're going to consider where that is in this blog article, the naturalistic root of morality. And the argument here is that if you dig deeper, premise 1, premise 2, if you dig all the way to the root of where morality comes from, my argument here is that morality comes from evolution. If you go all the way back to its source, it comes down to our DNA, it comes down to what is selected for, it comes down to what is successful, which is based on game theory. And so what happens is there's an interesting transition where when you're looking for the justification for the most primordial ought premise, right? What justifies the most basic ought premise? It just comes down to scientific facts, because you can't go deeper than the Big Bang, right? You can't go, you go all the way back. It's like, oh, because of the Big Bang, we got planets, and because we got planets, we got evolution, and because we got evolution, we have the first moral ought, which is I ought to exist. And then based on I ought to exist, we have evolution, we have game theory, natural selection, and all of our more complex moral principles, they all bubble up in an emergent fashion from these brute scientific facts. And so that helps build the foundation for where morality comes from. Then over here, I start to dig into meta-wellbeing, which is inspired by Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. Meta-wellbeing, I'm helping define how complex this well-being idea is. And so I dig into the different aspects and dimensions of well-being, and I call it meta-wellbeing to help differentiate and explain how complex this idea is, because most criticisms of the idea of well-being, they basically just strawman it by not appreciating how complex it really is. So that, if you have questions on what I'm even talking about when I say meta-wellbeing, this is where you want to go. After that, I dig into how this concept of meta-wellbeing can be applied across a variety of divergent issues. Simple moral dilemmas, complex moral dilemmas, value trade-offs, philosophic dilemmas like trolley problems, and even religious doctrines. So this kind of helps you see, it kind of helps make it more concrete. This abstract idea of well-being, how does it manifest in a concrete fashion? If you want examples, this is the place to go. But today, we are going to be digging into how do we philosophically justify building a foundation of morality based on meta-wellbeing. And a spoiler alert, the conclusion of this is going to feed into my next blog article, Why Meta-Wellbeing is Objective. So if you think the idea of morality being objective is controversial, you're definitely going to want to pay attention to the end, because today's discussion is going to build an argument that it bubbles up until the point where this meta-wellbeing principle can be concretely compared to another principle, which is I call moral game theoretism. So the principles of game theory, spoiler alert, game theory is theoretically an objective science because we can objectively calculate what is the best strategy irrespective of any person's stance or position or their subjective opinions. Like, we can ignore everyone's opinions and we can calculate the best strategy. And so basing morality on the best strategy is potentially an objective way to go. So without further ado, let's dig into this article. Why Meta-Wellbeing is Good, an explication of Sam Harris's philosophy within his book, The Moral Landscape, Part 3. So as I said in Part 1, for purposes of this review of the book, I will first address the soft proposition and then the hard proposition as formulated. Soft proposition. Meta-wellbeing is subjectively the best axiom to use as the foundation of morality. Hard proposition. Meta-wellbeing is objectively the foundation of morality and can be measured by science. Soft proposition. Meta-wellbeing is good. In the review of moral issues in Part 2, ranging across simple, complex, religious, applied ethical principles, and moral dilemmas, I have found that the common denominator of our moral intuitions across these landscapes is an ethic of meta-wellbeing. Whenever a set of options includes one option that clearly contains more meta-wellbeing, our moral intuitions will gravitate to that option. Complex moral issues seem to occur when there is a trade-off between different loci of well-being. Absent moral religious biases, we naturally know when religious practices are immoral, when we can clearly identify the harm that they pose to meta-wellbeing. The variety of principles involved in applying ethics can be reduced to different value systems within our meta-wellbeing. Moral dilemmas often look for obscure examples to help us question moral theories by pointing us to our moral intuitions. When our moral intuitions don't like a certain moral conclusion, we are appealing to a deeper value system within ourselves. A meta-wellbeing ethic includes these deeper value systems and hence addresses any moral dilemma. It seems to me like an ethic of meta-wellbeing provides the most robust axiom upon which to lay our moral foundations. Standards for measuring the quality of a meta-ethical theory. The first standard is reflective equilibrium. Reflective is the principle of bouncing something back and measuring it through a bounce back process. Equilibrium is where things balance out to a peaceful state. So what this means is, as we weigh our moral intuitions against the theory, we are reflecting our moral intuitions against our own moral theory. We will come across contradictions between the two, after which we will tweak our theory to match our intuitions, the process of which we will repeat until we are sufficiently comfortable with our theory's ability to match our intuitions. Second principle for measuring the quality of a meta-ethical theory is called the reliability challenge. Reliability is the theory something we can rely on? And so the challenge is going to pose some questions to see if our theory is actually reliable. So to propose that our moral theory is better than others, we must give a proper explanation for how other theories got morality wrong and why our methodology is more immune to the moral stumbling blocks that others have succumbed to. All right, reflective equilibrium. A metaethical theory can be considered of a higher quality than another if it is able to accurately account for our moral intuitions after deep moral reflection. Obstacles to reflective equilibrium include: 1. Moral intuitions fail to be consistent across dilemmas. For example, outliers. Number 2, self-contradictory moral intuitions. That means that our moral system is too shallow. It's not digging deep enough because it's contradicting that which is deeper. Number 3, the gap between the moral intuitions that we have and the moral intuitions we should have, ought. Number 1, moralistic resonance. The degree to which a moral theory can match our intuitions across a variety of issues. This is a very important principle. Resonance. Moralistic is how we make our moral rules. Resonance is, are they agreeing with our feelings? Is it when we think about it and it goes from our rational brain and it bounces down into our moral, emotional intuitions, is it agreeing and resonating with those deeper feelings? So if our moral theory can resonate with our feelings, it has achieved a degree of moralistic resonance. Number 2, moralistic integrity. The degree to which a moral theory is not self-contradictory. So what that means is oftentimes different parts of our brain have different opinions, and we're not being very cognizant of how our opinions are connected together. And so we can contradict ourselves if we say, oh, X is bad over here, but X is good over here. Oh, you've got a fundamental contradiction when you bring those two philosophies together. So having an ethical theory that doesn't contradict itself is superior. Moralistic goodness. The degree to which a moral theory reflects which moral intuitions we should have. Socrates. Socrates was the first Greek philosopher to delve deep into ethics. He inadvertently invented the Socratic method, which was basically a special type of conversational dialectic where Socrates' interlocutor would make a claim, and then Socrates would begin to interrogate this claim. Socrates' method of interrogation was often aimed at testing moralistic resonance, moralistic integrity, and moralistic goodness. Testing moralistic resonance. In Plato's book, Republic, Plato walks us through a conversation between Socrates and Cephalus. As usual, Socrates allows his interlocutor to guide the conversation in making certain claims, and then Socrates challenges those claims. Cephalus is humbler than most, and hence hesitant to claim that he knows the definition of righteousness, which is often poorly translated as something like justice from their Greek translation. To help continue the conversation, Socrates asks Cephalus if he would agree that the definition of righteousness is being honest and returning that which is owed. Socrates then challenges this definition by suggesting that it isn't always right to return that which is owed, contradicting a common moral intuition that you're supposed to repay that which people give you. Socrates puts forth an extraordinary case, an outlier, of a rare situation where one has borrowed a weapon from a friend, but later the friend returns and is in a state of madness. They are perhaps asking for the weapon to be returned to them while they're in a state of rage. Considering the friend's state of madness, perhaps an angry, drunken, murderous rage, it would not be right to return the weapon to him at this time, since harm might be resulted thereby. Hence, by pointing to this outlier case, Socrates shows how the principle of returning that which is owed does not resonate with our moral intuitions, as always being good no matter the situation. Socrates tests this principle for moralistic resonance and exposes a situation where it fails. So this is a little diagram, Socrates versus Cephalus, what is righteousness? And just kind of highlights how originally Socrates proposed a definition, a two-part definition of righteousness, as including honesty and returning stuff, but then by providing an outlier, he helps debunk the principle of returning stuff, how that is not always considered righteousness, and therefore highlighting that there's something about this definition that doesn't resonate with our moral intuitions. Testing moralistic integrity. When Euthyphro claims that which causes fear also causes shame, Socrates begins looking for contradictions. He points out that we are fearful of disease, but we are not ashamed of having disease. By finding a contradictory example, Socrates pokes holes in the initial claim. This gives Euthyphro an opportunity to revise his perspective regarding the relationship between fear and shame, so as to discover a more accurate perspective. Euthyphro's first claim, all shame is fear, therefore all fear is shame. Socrates' counter-argument, all disease is feared, but no disease is shameful. So then, because of this counter-argument, Euthyphro is able to adjust and make a more robust claim, a more accurate claim, which is all shame is fear, but not all fear is shame. Testing moralistic goodness. In Euthyphro's dilemma, Socrates discusses the source of goodness, or another translation is piousness. Socrates presents the dilemma to Euthyphro in a question. Is goodness loved by the gods because goodness is good, or is goodness good because it is loved by the gods? In one simple yet confusing question, Socrates opens wide the deepest question of metaethics. What is goodness? Or what is the foundation of goodness? If the foundation of goodness is some god's opinion, then goodness becomes arbitrary. If the foundation of goodness is outside some god's opinion, then gods are not the source of the definition of goodness. Or in other words, we must look outside religion in order to understand goodness. Over thousands of years, the foundation of goodness has been debated without total resolution. To test moralistic goodness, we must have a standard for which to measure goodness against. Then this standard must be proven to not be arbitrary. If goodness is arbitrary, then it is arguable that goodness doesn't exist. Socrates accepts the typical standard that goodness is measured against the gods' opinions. Then Socrates shows how this standard for goodness fails the test of moralistic goodness by being so arbitrary that in one moment murder could be evil, and then the next moment murder could be good, merely based on a change in the commands of the gods from one moment to the next. Euthyphro's dilemma. It's often talked about in two horns. You have to choose one of these conclusions, one of these horns. Either, first horn, God loves X because it is good. If that's true, then morality is independent of God because it was already good before God loved it. Second horn, X is good because God loves it. And the conclusion is morality is arbitrary. And why would morality be arbitrary? Just some simple examples. There's plenty of scriptures in Judeo-Christian doctrine. Thou shalt not kill. Killing is bad because God doesn't like it. But then, the Ammonites. God commands us to go kill the Ammonites. God commands me to kill my son, Isaac. God commands me to kill XYZ. There's many, many, many examples of God changing his mind about the virtue of killing. That's just one flip-flop. If God's allowed to flip-flop, then that just means goodness is as arbitrary as his opinion at the moment. Moralistic resonance. Looking for outlier examples has been a highly favored method of finding errors in moral theories. If a moral theory is of high quality, it should provide us with satisfactory moral solutions for any variety of moral dilemma. If a moral theory, when presented with a complex moral dilemma, fails to give us an answer that resonates with our innate moral intuitions, it has failed to provide us with moralistic resonance. If we wanted to measure the quality of a variety of moral theories in terms of moralistic resonance, we could come up with a suite of moral dilemmas and pose each of them to each theory. If we were to have 100 moral dilemmas at our disposal, we could test each theory against them and grade their answers to each dilemma. Perhaps consequentialism gives us satisfactory answers 60% of the time. And by satisfactory, it feels good. The consequentialist conclusion feels good to our intuitions. Perhaps virtue ethics gives us a satisfactory answer 20% of the time. It only feels like a good conclusion 20% of the time. Perhaps deontology gives us a satisfactory answer 40% of the time. We could then determine that in terms of moralistic resonance, in this situation, based on these measurements, consequentialism is the superior moral theory among the three due to 60% being a higher amount of resonance than 20 and 40. Currently, philosophers largely struggle between these three moral theories. In a 2009 poll performed by philosopher David Chalmers, they found that among over 3,000 philosophically educated people, the popularity of these three ethical theories was roughly equal. A follow-up poll in 2020 found very similar results. As you can see here, normative ethics, deontology, consequentialism, or virtue ethics. As you can see, the percentages, other was the most popular option, accept or lean towards deontology, 26%. Accept or lean towards consequentialism, 24%. Accept or lean towards virtue ethics, 18%. To me, this represents a large problem. As I see it, each of these three theories has a low degree of moralistic resonance. Based on the way you play with the variables in a trolley problem, you can destroy any of these three normative ethical theories. As you can see here, I've got a trolley problem dilemma. It says there's a man with a hand that is able to grab the lever. The lever is defaulted to kill 5 people on the default track. And if he pulls the lever, he'll switch it to a track that kills 1 person. Classic trolley problem, 1 versus 5. If you get involved, you are the cause of 1 person's death, but you are the cause of saving 5. This is a classic differentiation between deontology and utilitarianism, or individualism and collectivism. The utilitarian perspective. In order to maximize utility for the collective, 1 must be sacrificed for the many. To some, this can seem like an audacious standpoint that takes the power to control life and death into one's own hands. And the other, deontological individualism. I have a duty to not violate any individual's right to life, even if that means the consequence is bad for the collective, right? If you want to break simple deontology, all you have to do is stack up more and more hypothetical people on the default track until the deontologist is forced to admit that it is foolish to essentially destroy the entire human race over a deontological rule to not kill an innocent person no matter what the consequence. When the deontologist admits this, he or she is admitting that this version of deontology fails to resonate with their own moral intuitions when forced to address a more complex dilemma. As you can see, we just increase the number of people down here, and it makes the deontological decision very hard to just wash your hands. I'm not going to get involved here and just let everyone die. It doesn't work when you start stacking up lives. But if you want to break simple consequentialism or utilitarianism, all you have to do is switch the analogy from merely flipping a switch to actually pushing a fat man to his death in order to save the many. Most consequentialists will be forced to admit that when violence is added to the equation, they are ready to abandon their consequentialism in favor of deontology. If that doesn't do it, there are many other moral dilemmas available that will be able to do the trick. You can check out part 2 of this series, the meta-analysis of meta-wellbeing, many popular examples that help show consequentialism has many problems to it. It's by no means a flawless theory, at least simple interpretations thereof. Now, virtue ethics. If you want to break virtue ethics, all you need to do is present them with any ethical dilemma whatsoever. Virtue ethics does not provide any guidance as to how one should act, since it is a theory of inward attributes, not outward actions. A proponent of virtue ethics might say, In order to face a trolley problem, one must cultivate the virtue of courage in their life by avoiding the deficiency of cowardliness and refraining from the excess of rashness and foolhardiness. But that's not specific at all. Once one has cultivated courage, they will be internally ready to face the ethical dilemma. But then what? What should a courageous person do? If we're being creative, perhaps a courageous person should jump in front of the trolley and they should sacrifice themselves to protect the five. But what happens when you increase the size of the trolley so that heroism is no longer a solution? Virtue ethics runs out of ideas fast. What breaks? This is huge. What breaks? I've been using that word this whole time. What does it mean to say that a moral theory broke? Each time you attempt to break a metaethical theory, you tend to appeal to some examples of how your theory fails to accurately resonate with our collective moral intuitions. As humans, we are naturally appealing to the moral authority of our collective intuitions in order to judge a theory as good or bad. This inner standard is what everything is being measured against. The problem is that this inner standard is deeper, more complex, and more robust than our minds can even comprehend from moment to moment. It's like we have this deep reservoir of unconscious wisdom that we are trying to dive down and explore within ourselves. We are imperfect at introspection, so we can't fully see the shape of our internal moral wisdom each time we look for it. Collectively, we are like a group of blind people trying to feel the nature of an elephant in front of us. Each of us is feeling a different aspect of the elephant and hence develops a different perspective as to how we can model the structure of the elephant. But if we can merge all of our perspectives together, then we can build a more accurate understanding of the object of our exploration. Classic sunglasses moment. What is morality? Here's the elephant. And these different investigators, blind investigators, someone says, religion, survival, rules and rights, instincts, consequences, culture. And if you can see lightly imprinted into the elephant is the words game theory. Putting the glasses on for a more philosophic terminology. Viral meme strategy, materialistic, selfish, short-term strategy, deontological long-term strategy, emotivism, emotion-based heuristics, utilitarian social calculus, social constructivism. A variety of perspectives on where morality comes from, but are they all pointing to the same thing? Is there a deeper fundamental reality that comprises all moral theories? Challenges for moralistic resonance. Moralistic resonance relies on the intuitions of the majority of people as a standard for which to judge a theory. Different people have different temperaments which influence their moral intuitions. A psychopath may find no problem with certain aspects of moral dilemmas as their innate moral intuitions may be warped by their psychopathic condition. The idea of resonance is the degree to which there is a steady connection of agreement between a group and an idea. The theory with the smallest number of people that disagree will have the greatest amount of resonance. Perhaps a moral theory will be unable to resonate with psychopaths, but if it can resonate with the rest of the population, perhaps that is good enough until an even better theory comes along that resonates with both the majority of the people and the psychopaths. Moralistic synthesism as a solution. The idea of synthesis implies the act of joining things together, often in a synergistic way. When different populations of people disagree over something, there are often two opposing values that are causing the conflict. Perhaps freedom versus safety. Perhaps deontology prefers freedom and consequentialism prefers safety. Neither the thesis of deontology nor the antithesis of consequentialism Neither is a satisfactory endplace for society because neither of them resonate with a sufficiently large swath of the population. Moralistic synthesis is about looking for a new way of viewing the conflict that allows us to conjoin two opposing philosophies together in a way that reconciles, compromises, includes, unifies, and transcends. Moralistic synthesis can be measured as the degree to which a moral theory synthesizes opposing factors or values. Moralistic synthesis in the brain. Brain imaging studies conducted by Joshua Green seem to show that, biologically, we all have moral taste buds for both deontology and consequentialism. Since meta-wellbeing is about making brains happy, the moral choice will involve whichever choice satisfies both our deontological circuit and our consequentialist circuit to the degree that establishes an equilibrium between the two. Meta-wellbeing implies moralistic synthesis in order to achieve moralistic resonance. Joshua Green has done a variety of experiments on the brain in order to understand how we cognitively process trolley problems, for example. His work has largely found that we have 1. An emotional, fast, energy-efficient, autopilot, and ancient deontological circuit, along with a 2. Rational, slow, energy-inefficient, calculating, and recently developed utilitarian circuit. Philosophic rationalists like Socrates and Kant would be wrong to reduce morality to just the rational utilitarian circuit. Philosophic sentimentalists like Hume would be wrong to reduce morality to just the emotional deontological circuit. What actually happens during moral processing is a complex synthesis among many parts of the brain and a cooperation between these two circuits. Potential areas to apply moralistic synthesis. We could synthesize deontology and utilitarianism, getting that balance or equilibrium between them, making both happy at the same time. Similarly, virtue ethics and ethics of care. Left brain versus right brain. Emotion versus rationality. Skepticism versus faith. Progressivism versus conservatism. Cooperation versus competition. Self-love versus selfless love. Freedom versus safety. Feminine versus masculine. Short-term versus long-term. Individualism versus collectivism. Role conformity versus self-expression. Moralistic integrity. As said above, moralistic integrity is the degree to which a moral theory is not self-contradictory. Most people go about life without a lot of self-examination and are unaware of their many contradictory beliefs and actions. Philosopher Immanuel Kant produced one of the greatest moral theories for promoting moralistic integrity. In Kant's categorical imperative, he states, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." What he was aiming at with this categorical imperative was something like 1. Imagine all the rules that you wish other people would follow. 2. Recognize that you have the same duties that they have. 3. Follow the rules that you want others to follow. Kant was generating a philosophy based on the assumption that hypocritical morality has no moralistic integrity. How can we be mad at someone for stealing from us when we ourselves steal from others? This external ought, that we would wish to apply to others, the external ought being, we would like to apply externally, others ought not steal. Well, we must necessarily apply to ourselves an internal ought. So externally, they must not steal. Internally, we must not steal. We must go both ways if we are to maintain moralistic integrity. Kantian-style logic can similarly be applied to Sam Harris's axiom that well-being is good. We all necessarily have an internal ought of which we feel we ought to maximize our well-being. Yet similarly, other people have their own desires to maximize their well-being. In order to not be hypocritical, we must accept that all types of well-being are important, not just ours. So a little diagram, internally and externally. So Kant, he starts with the external and goes to the internal. And for Sam Harris, it would start with the internal and go to the external. So starting with the external, I believe that others ought not steal. We must conclude, therefore, I ought not steal. And with Sam Harris, I believe that my well-being is important. Therefore, others' well-being is important. Moralistic goodness. In order to satisfy our intuitions about moralistic goodness, we must find the foundation of goodness and explain how it is not arbitrary. If meta-well-being is the foundation of goodness, we can find that this isn't arbitrary, given that neuroscience increasingly has the ability to measure and quantify meta-well-being. If game theory is the foundation of goodness, we can find that this also isn't arbitrary, given that within a game, each constraint or rule applies a limitation to the number of optimal strategies. Given that our universe is a universe of entropy, there are many constraints on viable social strategies. For example, humans require cooperation to survive. Murderous strategies are hence not good in all cultures, since this harms our basic strategy as a species. If one is to have access to all the variables that constrain a game, it is possible to calculate which strategy is best. Hence, game theory is not an arbitrary definition of goodness. Reliability challenge. In order to demonstrate the reliability of an ethical framework, one must generate a convincing error theory to explain why other theories have gone wrong and why we have not. An error theory must have 1. An explanation for the telos of morality. 2. An explanation for what an error is. 3. An explanation for how errors arise. 4. A means of measuring how much a moralistic process is subject to error. 5. A means of measuring how good a job a moral theory does at accomplishing its purpose. So, the 5 dimensions of measurement for the reliability challenge. Number 1, moralistic telos, the innate purpose of morality. Number 2, moralistic error, the definition of error. Number 3, moralistic error generation, how errors arise. Number 4, moralistic invulnerability, the degree to which a moral theory is immune to error. 5, moralistic optimization, the degree to which a moral theory maximizes its goal or telos. Moralistic telos. A telos implies an innate purpose built into the structure of something. The telos of a seed would be to grow into a plant. If we dig into our own introspection of morality, we can know that we have rational moral conclusions that are inspired by deeper moral emotions. We can dig further and realize that our rationality and emotions come from brain states. Brain states come from our biological states. Biological states come from our genetic makeup, which is our nature, and the epigenetic developmental impacts of our environment, which would be nurture. To the extent our morality comes from our genetic makeup, that aspect of our morality comes from the forces of natural selection that determine which moralities survive and thrive. To the extent our morality comes from our environment, that aspect of our morality can be socially constructed by culture. To the extent that cultural norms are beneficial or harmful to survival, natural selection will also determine those socially constructed norms. Successful cultures will survive and thrive, while unsuccessful cultures will disappear. If the nature and nurture aspects of our morality both boil down to natural selection, and natural selection boils down to game theory, that means that game theoretic principles determine which moralities will be more successful. So here is a little diagram of the hierarchy of where the root of morality comes from. Meta-well-being is this upper half of the pyramid, and game theory is the foundation. We have our actions, our supposedly moral actions. We have our rational moral conclusions. We have our deeper moral emotions. We have our brain states, our biological states, our genes and environment. And we have natural selection. And we have game theoretic principles that govern everything above them. As evolution generates a variety of strategies, evolution will simultaneously generate a variety of moralities. The success of a morality will depend on how successful its underlying game theoretic principles are. Hence, the telos of morality is to express the most successful set of game theoretic principles that this creature is able to comprehend. Different types of morality could be evaluated as game theoretic strategies with different aptitudes for success. Hence, moralities could be ranked into hierarchies, revealing the most successful morality at the top. It seems clear that P1, premise 1, if a moral code is beneficial to the game theoretic strategy of the individual's genes, and P2, premise 2, evolution has the ability to program an individual with such a moral code via genetic or cultural programming, then conclusion, evolution will program that individual to intuit that moral code as good. Goodness naturally containing a positive motivational valence. So, given these premises, the pure essence of our moral intuitions is merely that which evolution has inspired us with. In order to get us to actually follow beneficial moral codes, evolution must hardwire our well-being to be intimately connected with these moral codes. We must feel good when we do good things in order for us to have the biological motivation to actually be good. So meta-well-being is a necessary implementation mechanism for game theoretic moral coding. So since evolutionary pressures, both cultural and genetic, produce moral intuitions, evolutionary pressures define what is good. Hence, the purpose of goodness is to satisfy evolutionary pressures via the best game theoretic strategy. The definition of goodness is inescapable from evolutionary pressures, since any creature or group that has a definition of goodness that runs contrary to evolutionary pressures will be destroyed by those pressures. Yet, evolutionary pressures are not so clearly defined so as to affirm only one set of moral principles. Reality is complex in that there are multiple viable strategies for surviving and thriving. Not every deviation from optimal morality will be instantly destroyed. Some strategies maximize short-term benefits at the cost of the long term. It could be that certain strategies are very successful in the first millennium of their operation, but they start to backfire in the second millennium of their operation. It is not surprising that we find a variety of moralities in the world, each struggling forward. It is most likely the case that no group of humans has landed on the most successful morality, as none of us are competent enough to understand it. Yet these evolutionary pressures are constantly guiding us towards it, nevertheless. A key element to make clear here is that evolutionary pressures apply to genes, not to individuals. The best game theoretic strategy for the individual is not necessarily the best game theoretic strategy for the genes. The genes can live distributed throughout a group. Heroism, defined as risking or sacrificing one's life for others, is a bad game theoretic strategy for the individual, but it's a great game theoretic strategy for the genes. If one carrier of the genes sacrifices himself in order to save perhaps 5 carriers of the genes, that is a net win for the genes. It's classic trading 1 for the 5. Evolutionarily, you get all those extra points. One could imagine a tribal landscape where frequently the village hero must risk his life to defend women and children from a lion attack. Since genes operate on ratios, it would make sense that different sets of genes have different propensities for producing heroes. Perhaps one tribe's genes have a 1% rate of producing a hero. Another tribe's genes may have a 0% chance of producing a hero. If 2 tribes of humans are competing, the tribe that contains heroes might grow at a faster rate than the other tribe that contains no heroes, because the heroes are reducing the total lion deaths within their tribe. The tribe that grows faster will eventually be the one that will win in a war. And so these heroic genes would likely become a continuous aspect of tribal genes going forward through time. What this example shows is that a tribal morality that lacked heroism was an inferior morality to one that contained an element of her heroism. Moralistic error. A moralistic error would be a moral intuition that fails to align with the optimal game theoretic strategy for a given situation. Theoretically, there exists some optimal game theoretic strategy for all situations. Furthermore, there also exists a large number of suboptimal game theoretic strategies along a spectrum of varying degrees of strategic quality. The gap between an executed game theoretic strategy and the optimal game theoretic strategy is a measurement of moralistic error. Game theoretic strategies can be volatile. An optimal strategy can change when the factors in the environment change. It makes sense that each culture would evolve a different morality, since there might be nuances to each area that require adjustments to their moral strategy. Not every moral gap between cultures or environments would be considered a moralistic error. It is imaginable that cultures that arose in deserts might have special moral rules revolving around management of water, whereas cultures that arose in areas with plenty of water might completely lack these water-oriented moral intuitions. Cultures in one environment might require special rules to make their strategy work, whereas cultures in another environment won't need those rules for their strategy. Moralistic error generation. Evolution can make mistakes. Evolution can randomly generate new moral codes as it explores reality with random mutations, but there is no guarantee that these new moral codes will be successful. Reality can be more complex than the moral equipment offered by evolution. Perhaps just as evolution gave us a fallible physics engine for calculating perhaps ballistic movements of objects that allow us to play sports, evolution also gave us a fallible moral engine for calculating social strategies that allow us to cooperate. Natural selection has always been applied to the quality of our moral engine, which means the pressures of natural selection are constantly refining our moral engine, just like it's refining our physics engine. So it's reasonable to presume that our moral engines are trying to approach the optimal game theory, but there's no guarantee that our brains are smart enough to even get there. We might not have enough neurons to calculate the best strategy, so we're just dumb enough to get the smartest possible strategy our brain is able to produce. Additionally, our moral intuitions are going to have a perennial bias. Perennial is ancient wisdom. Our moral feelings have a bias towards ancient strategies because the optimal game theoretic strategy for an ancient environment, that was where we came from. So all of the evolution of our moral feelings, it evolved in an ancient environment, so we have ancient emotions. So there's a bias towards ancient strategies. Given the gap between our ancient environment and our modern environment, it is reasonable to assume that our moral intuitions are not fully calibrated for our modern environment. Also, the history of science and philosophy has a bias towards parsimony, which is the principle of simplifying things. We like things simple. Simple makes our brains happy. Just having one explanation. So because we have a bias towards parsimony, this results in reductive theories that crudely reduce our understanding of reality to just one principle. For example, deontology just reduces morality to rules, and consequentialism reduces morality to consequences. This reductivism sacrifices accuracy by entertaining simplicity. Reductive moral conclusions are likely to produce errors since the complexity of game theory cannot be reduced to just one factor. Another source of harmful error is the short-term timeframe bias. Each time harmful behavior, criminality, or atrocities are favored, a short-term benefit is being prioritized over long-term stability, hence a short-sighted game theoretic strategy. Types of errors. Number 1, random mutations. Number 2, fallibility of our moral engine. Number 3, perennial bias. Number 4, reductionism. Number 5, short-term bias. Moralistic invulnerability. Moralistic invulnerability is the degree to which a moral theory is immune to error. A theory is invulnerable to error to the degree it contains mechanisms for resolving or avoiding errors. An exploration of the types of mitigation factors available is shown below. Type of error, random mutation. Mitigation factor, majority rules. Only the outliers in society will have harmful mutations. Number 2, fallibility of our moral engine. Mitigation factor, group brainstorming dialectic. Hive mind calculations for morality will be more complex, more robust, and superior to single mind moral calculations. Number 3, perennial bias. Mitigation factor, moralistic flexibility. Adapt moral codes to new information. Increased priority on cognitive morality over instinctual morality. Number 4, reductionism. Mitigation factor, moralistic synthesism. Absorb newly discovered moralities into old frameworks. Instead of reducing morality to just one principle, combine all the principles to give us the most robust and complex moral system. Number 5, short-term bias. Mitigation factor, moralistic disgust. Labeling short-term strategies as evil can allow us to collectively punish and reduce them. All right, so from here, we want to zoom in onto the second type of error. Right here, we have the fallibility of our moral engine, and the mitigation factor is group brainstorming dialectic. So, if we zoom in to analyze this, I've got 3 different ways that our moral engine is fallible, and the solution within the group brainstorming dialectic. The first one, value hierarchy disagreement. So, for example, valuing safety or valuing freedom. Which one is higher? Which one should have a higher priority in our legal system, right? We could disagree about which comes first. The solution is moralistic goodness, learning how to measure goodness in order to identify the highest good. The next is internal contradictions, and the solution is moralistic integrity. Reformulate complex moral conclusions in a way that doesn't contradict simple moral conclusions. And this third one is our conclusions violate our intuitions. And the solution is moralistic resonance. Reject conclusions that violate collective intuitions. So these 3 moralistic categories that we've been discussing for the reliability challenge and reflective equilibrium, these 3 components factor into how accurate is our moral engine. Moralistic optimization. Moralistic optimization is the degree to which a moral code optimizes itself to meet its goals. Within the philosophy of ethics, different moral theories might have different goals and hence different optimization strategies. The goal of deontology is to abide by rules. The goal of consequentialism is to ensure the best consequences. Moral game theoretism, as proposed here, would define morality as an exploration of which principles maximize game theoretic success of the genes. When assessing approaches to morality, game theoretic success will be the judge that determines the path forward. When debating whether our moral theory should prioritize moral emotional instincts over moral cognitive conclusions, the right answer is to prioritize the intuition that maximizes game theoretic success. For example, on the abortion issue, it makes sense that we have a perennial emotional bias to want to protect fetuses, since throughout our evolutionary history, children have been very important to our game theoretic strategy. Yet, in our modern age, we face the risk of overpopulating our planet. Our perennial instincts no longer represent the best game theoretic strategy forward. We can cognitively deduce that if we overpopulate ourselves, we may face a self-destruction event, which is very bad for our game theoretic strategy. Our rational conclusions give us ways to adapt to our new environment in ways that our perennial emotions cannot. To the extent that deep moral emotions and instincts sabotage our game theoretic strategy, they must be suppressed by rational moral forces. Additionally, time frame plays a huge role in game theoretic optimization. A game theory could be optimized for the present moment, for the short run, for the medium run, for the long run, or for perpetuity. As addressed above, a short-term bias accounts for moralistic error. The reason for this is that true optimization must sum up success over all time frames. A short-run strategy of crime may have a net game theoretic advantage in the short run. You go rob a bank, you get thousands of dollars. It's really good for the short run. But it fails in the long run due to retribution, due to punishment, due to law enforcement, due to jail time. If you measure up all the gains and losses of a crime strategy over eternity, the short-term benefit is eclipsed by the eternal game theoretic failure when retribution results in death or life in jail. The punishment destroys any future evolutionary success. Hence, a short-term strategy fails at optimizing game theoretic strategy. If we analyze the course of evolution, it has been a constant battle between competitive tendencies and cooperative tendencies. Competitive tendencies were manifestations of short-term strategies that tried to gain an advantage over others. Each time these competitive tendencies manifest, the victims of abuse will begin to evolve retributive strategies to punish those who abuse them. Examples of this can be found in bacteria, insects, chickens, or humans. One type of bacteria may evolve a mechanism to eat faster than all of the competition. This initially makes it much more successful than regular bacteria, but then vicious bacteria will evolve to generate poison to destroy others, igniting an evolutionary arms race, where the other bacteria scramble to know how to respond to this new threat. The bacteria that evolved to eat faster ends up dying faster because it eats up all the poison. Yet another type of bacteria will evolve immunities to the toxin. This results in a paper, rock, scissors type of standoff, as the poisonous bacteria can overcome the gluttonous bacteria one-on-one, and the gluttonous bacteria can overcome the immune bacteria one-on-one, and the immune bacteria can overcome the poisonous bacteria one-on-one. It turns into a stalemate, because each type of bacteria is wasting excess energy on its strategy, of which their efforts cancel each other out. The bacteria arms race shows that competition results in wasted energy, in fighting, and perhaps bacteria that avoided the conflict altogether would be more productive. This is a model of an actual study of how bacteria competition operates, and there's the paper, rock, scissors phenomenon, where each strategy counters a different strategy, and it eventuates in a stalemate. So, in fact, the evolution from single-celled organisms, bacteria, to multicellular organisms, it looks like a transition from competition to cooperation. For example, within cells, there's the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the energy generator within each of our cells, and it looks like it used to be a separate bacterium anciently, but somehow it got absorbed into our cells, creating a symbiotic relationship of mutual aid and cooperation. Afterwards, more cells started cooperating until they became a multicellular, harmonious entity. These multicellular organisms were able to survive and thrive because this cellular cooperation gave them an advantage. the evolutionary trend has been towards greater and greater cooperation of cells as large mammals were eventually produced. In fly experiments, researchers have found examples of male flies evolving poisonous sperm. The game theoretic advantage given to the male flies was in their sperm's ability to kill the competing sperm of rival males that were focused on the same mate. By killing competing sperm within your mate, a poisonous fly was able to achieve reproductive superiority. The only problem was that the poison also harmed the mother. So this was a short-term strategy. The mothers eventually would die due to this poison, and it would harm their future reproductive capabilities. So the mothers, in order to be successful, they had to evolve ways to neutralize the poison. So the entire competitive enterprise was a waste of energy for the group. Other competing populations of flies, they would easily outcompete this poison strategy, since cooperative fly populations, they don't need to waste energy on producing poisons and then neutralizing poisons. This example shows how short-term strategies that operate on individual selfishness can harm the group. And the group, without the internecine conflict, will be more successful. Within chickens, breeding experiments looked for the difference between breeding from only the best egg-laying chicken within each coop, or breeding only from the best egg-laying coop of chickens among all the coops of chickens. This tested the gap between individual selection and group selection. At the individual layer, the best egg-laying individual chicken was often the most aggressive female who beat all the other females into submission so she could take the greatest proportion of the food. At the group layer, the best egg-laying groups of chickens were the cooperative and peaceful groups that wouldn't harm each other, but rather they let each other take their fair share of food. Generations of chickens born from the cooperative groups were way more productive at producing eggs than generations of chickens born from the aggressive females, since a coop of aggressive females resulted in lots of internecine conflict that harmed the collective health and egg-laying capacities of their group. This shows that short-term strategies of aggression are not successful strategies in the long run. Within humans, we can see the same trend away from small group competition and towards large group cooperation. The history of civilization is a history of evolution towards larger and larger scopes of cooperation, from families to tribes, from tribes to cities, from cities to states, states to nations, nations to empires, empires to religious hegemonies, and from religious hegemonies to global orders. This is showing, again, that cooperative strategies are much more successful than competitive strategies in the long run. It seems apparent that game theory is naturally attracted towards more cooperation, more love, and more well-being. This means that we can measure the optimization level of our morality by seeing how large a scope of cooperation, love, and well-being it can support. What all of these examples show is that the trend of evolution is towards greater and greater scopes of cooperation, love, respect, and unity. As long as time is unlimited, greater scopes of cooperation will defeat narrower scopes of cooperation. Hence, we can use moral scope to measure the optimization of a morality. Moralities that focus on smaller scopes are inferior to moralities that focus on larger scopes, given that, in the long run, larger scopes are more successful. Optimization versus inclusion. One might critique this perspective by introducing the moral inclusion of other animals within the scope of our morality. Most people of our modern age would agree that it is morally superior to incorporate the well-being of animals within our moralities. Yet, the critic might claim that this intuition contradicts the premise of moral game theoreticism, given that an optimization function for human genes does not require the moral consideration of other animals. There are many reasons why I believe this is untrue. First, we have a symbiotic relationship with the animals of the earth. Their extinction is to our disadvantage. We rely on a variety of animals for food, labor, medicine, pollination, fertilizer, scientific research, etc. Second, enmity between human genes and animal genes can result in an evolutionary arms race to defeat each other. The more pressure we put on other species, the more likely they are to evolve ways to combat the pressures we apply to them. Third, the evolutionary temperaments required for humans to abuse animals include, for example, lack of empathy, malice, sadism, moral contradiction. Only those who lack empathy will be able to abuse animals. Malice and sadism motivate abuse. The ability to act in morally contradictory ways enables a human to simultaneously understand the principle of, I don't want to suffer, yet fail to respect that fact that animals don't want to suffer. All of these attributes that allow for animal suffering are attributes that cause internecine conflict within human tribes. Perhaps evolution could find a way to program us with moral contradictions by having empathy for humans, but apathy towards animals, geniality towards humans, and malice towards animals, compersion towards humans, and epicuricacy towards animals, moral integrity on human issues, and moral contradiction on animal issues. We would perhaps have a successful human game-theoretic morality despite containing the capacity for great abuses of animals. Yet this would just be to the human advantage in the short run. In the long run, abused animals may be able to attack back in some version of evolutionary karma, where they evolve to emit certain poisons or evolve certain diseases to wipe us out. The best long-term game-theoretic strategy for humans is to find ways to cooperate with other animals so that it isn't in their evolutionary interests to take revenge on us. A type of human-animal symbiosis. Positive-sum interactions, rather than zero-sum. So, now to return to the title of this blog article, the very premise of everything we're discussing, why meta-wellbeing is good. As we have discussed, evolutionary pressures push morality towards the most ideal game-theoretic strategy. In this sense, evolutionary pressures are defining the good. Evolution's means of communicating the good is via well-being. A creature knows that pain is bad and to be avoided. What they don't know is that the reason pain is bad is because pain signifies a behavior that harms the game-theoretic strategy of the genes. Similarly, a creature knows that pleasure is good and to be sought out. But what they don't know is that the reason pleasure is good is because pleasure signifies a behavior that helps the game-theoretic strategy of its genes. Simple well-being at the level of pleasure and pain, which could be called hedonism, is the best game-theoretic strategy simple creatures can accomplish. But humans are more advanced. While monkeys may fail a variant of the marshmallow test when it comes to delayed gratification, many human children can pass the test of delayed gratification in order to get a greater reward in the future. This means that on top of our well-being system is a meta-well-being system that is analyzing pleasure across time. While our simplistic animal well-being motivations want short-term reward, our meta-well-being circuit is calculating the fact that delayed gratification is a superior strategy for maximizing well-being, and hence a better game-theoretic strategy. Perhaps our short-term animalistic motivations desire to do harsh things to those we don't like. But then, it is likely that we feel regret and remorse over our antisocial actions. This is signifying a greater wisdom located at the meta-well-being level that has noticed that we have sacrificed the benefit of a good reputation over the long run for the short-term reward of punishing someone we don't like. The long-run wisdom at the meta-well-being level most likely desires to punish the rest of the brain, to punish that animalistic brain for allowing the short-term hedonistic brain circuits to make that harmful decision. This pain of regret is likely meant to reprogram the brain to be more careful next time and avoid trading the long run for the short run. Meta-well-being is split between bodily well-being and moralistic well-being. While evolution programs hedonistic well-being to optimize bodily success, evolution programs moralistic well-being to respond to game theory implementation. Humans are social creatures, so the structure of our society is very important to us. We want to raise our children in societies that will be friendly to them. Hence, prima facie, promoting a friendly society is obviously a better game theoretic strategy for raising children than promoting a violent society. So this is just a little diagram of bodily well-being versus moralistic well-being. Part of the brain is happy when our needs are met, when we're eating enough, when we're drinking enough, when we're sleeping enough. We manage all of these bodily functions and we get well-being, but then social well-being factors. Is our society set up in a nice way? This affects a different part of the brain and is also part of meta-well-being. These evolutionary pressures will then reward people who have the emotions needed to promote friendly societies. So it isn't far-fetched to imagine that our minds have evolved to model the type of social strategy that it would like implemented in the world. Or in other words, we evolved to each imagine our own versions of a utopia. Our moralistic well-being would then be programmed to attach to this vision of a utopia. If we desire to live in a world where children are not bullied on the playground, upon sight of bullying, we will sense a gap between our ideal society and the actual society before us. This will trigger a negatively valenced emotion that will give us the desire to brainstorm ways to undo this negative aspect of our current reality and push reality towards our ideal game theoretic utopia. Hence, our moralistic well-being can include all sorts of features: ideal rules, deontology; ideal virtues, virtue ethics; ideal consequences, utilitarianism. Our brains will attempt to do the math as to how to prioritize each of these aspects of a desired utopia. Yet, it is obvious that the ideal game theoretic strategy is too complex for anyone to calculate. If evolutionary pressures molded the structure of moralistic well-being to approach the best utopia it can imagine, then that means that moralistic well-being is attempting to track ideal game theory. Since moral calculations trigger errors at the individual level, relying on the intuitions of a single individual, for example, monarchies and religions, they have kings and popes. If you rely on just the king or just the pope to model your society, it's not going to provide you with the most ideal game theory. Increasing the scope of moralistic well-being to collective moralistic well-being would be the way to approach the best game theoretic strategy. We need not worry about the gap between moralistic well-being and bodily well-being, since moralistic well-being should naturally include the considerations of bodily well-being. Since these forces inform and assist each other, the umbrella term of meta-well-being would be the more useful term to encompass the entire scope of the moral enterprise. Moralistic resonance: the degree to which a moral theory can match our intuitions across a variety of issues. So this forms a little spectrum, a little scale, and this is just kind of my estimate of where different theories might be placed along the spectrum, where 0% means a theory has no moralistic resonance, and 100% means that a theory has complete moralistic resonance. Virtue ethics, in my opinion, has the lowest moralistic resonance, since it is not very good at coming up with solutions to ethical dilemmas. Consequentialism, it's in its simple form, is second worst because there's so many problems where someone once said, in the movies, the villains are always consequentialists and the heroes are deontologists. So it's because it can go awry really easily. It can kind of go off the deep end and come to really horrific conclusions quite easily. So it loses a lot of resonance pretty easily. Deontology, rule-based morality, it's human rights. A lot of people really value human rights, and religions are based on rules and duties. So this one really appeals to a lot of people, and it makes sense evolutionarily that deontology is pretty popular. but it's not that great either. It's on the spectrum, it looks like it's about 40% resonance, which means it fails 60% of the time. Yeah, that's just a guesstimate. You could theoretically come up with questionnaires that gave a more robust calculation. This is just my guess as to where things would lie. Now, if you study other more advanced moral theories, there's a more advanced version of consequentialism and a more advanced version of deontology that are much better. They solve a lot of the problems. Threshold deontology is basically, as a default, you use deontology, but when problems get to a big enough degree, you switch to consequentialism. So for example, a trolley problem. Normally, you just allow the default to kill people. Normally, you don't get involved. You don't cause the death of one person to save 5. Normally, you respect the individual's right to life. But the threshold, if you increase it from 5 deaths to 10 deaths to 100 deaths to 1,000, if you increase the number of deaths to a sufficient threshold, then you switch from deontology to consequentialism. That is superior. It resonates because it solves different dilemmas. Originally, deontology, it fails to solve a high death count trolley problem, but threshold deontology, it solves the high death count trolley problem because it resonates with our feelings. Rule utilitarianism, it's the same it's similar in that rules harkens to deontology. Basically, rule utilitarianism is we should follow the rules that give us the best consequences. So both of these are a synthesis between rules and consequences. And because they synthesize, they are more robust and they give us more resonance. But they're not that perfect. And that's why I believe meta-wellbeing and moral game theoreticism, these two offer much higher degrees of moralistic resonance. Because meta-wellbeing, it addresses every possible nuance within our brain. Any trolley problem you throw at us, what are we going to do? We're going to say, oh, your theory fails because my feelings don't match the conclusion of the theory. But meta-wellbeing, it functionally says that your feelings are the conclusion of the theory. So it's in a way, it's impossible for meta-wellbeing to contradict. It's impossible for it to contradict your intuitions because meta-wellbeing, it is your moral intuitions. And moral game theoreticism, that is just merely the abstraction of the well-being. The well-being is the instantiation of the game theoreticism. But I think moral game theoreticism, it should be slightly higher because game theoreticism, it transcends well-being in that it could be that all of our well-being is not smart enough to appreciate the best game theory. But theoretically, game theoreticism is smart enough, given omniscience, given knowledge of all the variables. This could theoretically calculate a more optimal strategy than what evolution has given us via well-being. Goodness is meta-well-being, but is meta-well-being good? G.E. Moore formulated the open question argument, meant to challenge anyone who tried to define goodness. He basically says that if something, X, is equivalent to goodness, then the question, is X good, would be a meaningless question. If we can find any contradiction, perhaps find something that X does not include, then this definition of goodness will be debunked. So a little diagram. Is blank good? So if you see here, goodness is the entire circle, and there's a nested circle of pleasure. Over here, a nested circle of rules, and over here, a nested circle of virtue. So you could say goodness also includes valuing truth or bravery, not just pleasure. Therefore, goodness does not equal pleasure. So what it's saying is that you can't limit goodness to this smaller circle if there is something that is good that is outside of the circle. So if you say goodness is equivalent to pleasure, then necessarily there is no outer circle. But if you can identify something that is good that is outside the circle, you've debunked this definition. So If you want to equate goodness with rules, this definition could be debunked if you identify consequences as good or virtues as good. Anything outside of rules, if it is good, then that's a bad definition. Same thing with virtue. Basically what's going on here, it's reductive. Pleasure is reductive because there are things outside of pleasure that are good. Rules are reductive, there's things outside of rules. Virtue is reductive, there are things outside of rules that are good. So the definition of goodness must be robust and broad enough to incorporate all of the factors that we call good. If we reduce goodness to simple pleasure, or rules, or virtues, we can find plenty of contradictions because there are many things that we consider good that are outside of the scopes of these definitions. So, for G.E. Moore's open question, we could plug in the blank and we could ask the question, is meta-well-being good? So, meta-well-being across all of these contexts. Pleasure. So, you could say simple well-being is like current pleasure, but meta-well-being is like the combination of current pleasure and future pleasure. So the meta-well-being is this complex pleasure. Analogously, you have bodily well-being, which would be that simple pleasure, and you have moralistic well-being, which is that future pleasure, and this combination is meta-well-being, which is that complex pleasure. Analogously, game theory would be identical to meta-well-being, and the simplistic idea of game theory is the strategy for just yourself. But the more complex aspect of game theory is strategy for the genes, the collective strategy, and the combination is the entirety of game theory, which would be identical or analogous to complex pleasure and meta-well-being. And therefore we are concluding, or we're positing, that goodness is equivalent to all of these forms. And so goodness is a combination of that which is good for yourself and that which is good for others. And this combination is the entirety of the essence of goodness. And we can propagate this definition across these contexts, and it seems to check out. So goodness, it includes all the good things. Evolution programs all the good things to have a positive pleasure valence. All aspects of morality must be encoded into us as a type of pleasure in order for them to have effect. Meta-well-being is the aggregation of all pleasures. If a set of pleasures sabotages the genes, it will fail and cease to exist. If a set of pleasures gives the genes success, it will succeed and propagate. Only sets of pleasures that promote sufficient game-theoretic strategies will exist. The definition of goodness comes from our intuitions about our pleasures, which come from evolution. Therefore, goodness equals complex pleasure equals meta-well-being equals game-theoretic strategy. If we reduce goodness to an all-encompassing concept like complex pleasure, or meta-well-being, or game theory, we will find that these definitions hold. The only way something can be good is if it falls within the scope of pleasure. For if anyone thinks X is good, they must have a pleasurable emotion towards X. Rules, virtues, and consequences are all forms of psychological pleasure in the minds of those who value them. Since evolution determines what is pleasurable, the best game-theoretic strategy will contain the most enduring source of pleasure. Each person may have a different definition of goodness, deriving pleasure from different things. There may be multiple levels of psychological goodness as people learn to evolve their psychology from self-oriented moralities towards universal moralities. The intentions, the psychological intentions of someone's mind may be good, but the results, the ontological facts that they bring into the world may be bad. Evolution will slowly guide all of our psychologies towards the best form of goodness. Is fake well-being good? This is a great question. A philosophic dilemma meant to challenge the primacy of pleasure in well-being-oriented philosophies is called the experience machine, or the pleasure machine. Philosopher Robert Nozick posited the existence of a machine that would have the ability to enchant the mind with delusions of maximal pleasure. Robert argues that if pleasure is the only thing important to us, then we will not have any qualms with the proposition to enter into this virtual reality and live out the rest of our lives within a manufactured fantasy of happiness. The key problem with this dilemma is that it reduces the idea of pleasure to its most simplistic form: simple pain and simple pleasure. It does not include the pleasure of knowing that you embody the virtue of bravery in embracing a true reality with the ability to effect true change. A common problem in human thinking is the desire for parsimony, the idea of reducing our explanation of things to one simple factor. Moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt is an outspoken critic of the epistemic virtue of parsimony, specifically within the realm of morality. Jonathan puts forward a model of morality that includes 5 moral dimensions, namely care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. The concept of meta-well-being, consistent with the type of well-being put forward by Sam Harris, is inclusive of all of these values within the brain. It includes all of Jonathan Haidt's 5 dimensions. The mere fact that the brain values truth or reality might be enough to reject the pleasure machine. For people who voluntarily reject the pleasure machine, this rejection would be evidence that their brain values something other than simple pleasure. The pleasure obtained only by possessing the truth. This might alone be great enough of a factor to surpass the pleasure obtainable by the pleasure machine. So a little simple diagram. Question: should I enter a virtual reality that can provide me with maximal happiness, despite being unreal? So if you think that the brain values only pleasure, then the conclusion is yes. Under hedonism, yes, we should enter this virtual reality. But under meta-well-being, we appreciate that the brain, it values different things. And simple pleasure is one of the things it values, but bravery and truth are other things that it values. And if this cortex, or if this circuit is stronger than the others, it will dominate. And your decision to value truth is evidence that this cortex is stronger than the other cortexes. And that decision, that voluntaristic decision, is evidence that truth is more important than pleasure. The fact that you reject it means that this is more important. But the value of truth in and of itself is a type of pleasure within meta-well-being. It's a complex pleasure. Of course, the pleasure obtained by the feeling that you possess the truth can be illusory. It is possible that the pleasure machine can likewise generate the pleasure of the illusion of possessing the truth. Before entering the machine, we will know that the machine cannot give us the pleasure of possessing the real truth. Our greater knowledge might allow us to reject the machine on this account. Yet, once we are within the machine, it might be harder to judge if one should be exposed to the truth and lose the pleasure derived from their illusion of possessing the truth. For me, as someone who used to be a devout theist, a very devout theist, I have experienced the pleasure derived from the illusion of understanding a reality based on a religious fantasy. Having to detach my brain from this fantasy disconnected me from the pleasure derivable only from that fantasy. Yet I can confirm that for me, the pleasure of knowing that I was approaching a more accurate version of the truth was preferable to remaining within a fantasy. I would never choose to go back and allow my brain to re-enter the enchanted fantasy of believing that there was a loving God hovering over my shoulder at all times, despite the comfort and encouragement this fantasy provided. For me, truth was almost infinitely more important. The only way we can have an optimal game theoretic strategy is if our strategy is connected to the truth. Hence, the deepest purpose of our well-being rests on truth. Now to jump into a criticism of evolutionary moral game theoreticism. Quote, however, empirical research on game theory outside of perfect competitive market interactions shows that game theoretic predictions based on the self-regarding actor model generally fail. In such situations, the character virtues, as well as both altruistic cooperation, helping others at a cost to oneself, and altruistic punishment, hurting others at a cost to oneself, are often observed. This criticism of game theory fails because it makes the false assumption that evolutionary moral game theory is focused on individual success instead of the success of the genes. Just to highlight it here, self-regarding actor model. In their study, which tried to debunk game theory as a source of morality, they were focused on the game theory of this self-regarding actor model, which is just an individual. They're not focused at the level of the group.